Rapidly rising waters forcing thousands of residents from their homes. Millions of sandbags and truckloads of volunteers coming together to keep the Minnesota River at bay. More than 2,000 volunteers built a 30-foot tall wall of sandbags in just 36 hours. In total, 39 counties were declared disaster areas following the flood of 1965. Welcome to the Remembering the Flood of 1965. I'm Mitch Keegan. In April 1965, residents of the Minnesota River Valley faced some of the worst of Mother Nature's wrath. They had dealt with flooding before and knew they were in for a fight. In the next 30 minutes, we'll look back at the flood of April 1965, what happened during the flood, and what has changed to prevent flooding like that happening again. But we begin with the weather conditions that caused the flood. For that, we turn to the Blue Earth County Historical Society.
The winter of 1965 was a very snowy and cold winter. We think that some of our winters in the most recent past have been bad. This one was a really rough winter. Almost 60 inches of snow fell. Around St. Patrick's Day in 1965 was a major blizzard that dumped 9 inches of snow, which doesn't seem that bad, but the winds were almost 50 miles an hour, which caused drifts up to 10 to 25 feet deep. So the snowpack was pretty intense, and in a very short window of time, basically in a 2 to 3 week window of time, the snow melted rapidly and there was nowhere for that water and the ice to go except for right into the rivers, which made the rivers swell. The rain at the beginning of April is really what kind of set everything off. So the snowpack was intense, but then the rain came, which typically we see in spring, but we see temperatures rise slowly with rain coming in and melting things in a slow pace. However, the rain was pretty heavy at times and there was a lot of it, which just meant that the snow was melting fast and there was just nowhere for anything to go. Because the rain came so quickly, the snow was thawing so fast, and the rivers again were frozen. So all of this was coming together, and the Minnesota River in particular was just miles and miles of huge ice chunks. Some of them 40 feet wide were coming down the Minnesota River. So when they would hit bridges that were lower, they would get stuck under the bridges, which would cause ice dams. And the ice dams then would displace the water out of the river banks and flood those local areas. So it was really imperative at that time to break up the ice dams to try to keep the river flowing and to try to minimize that regional flooding.
The flood of 1965 forever changed the landscape and the lives of many residents in the Minnesota River Valley. KEYC News 12's Ashley Hanley met up with some residents who remembered the fight to save the city.
Today, the waters of the Minnesota River run calmly through the valley. But 50 years ago this week, the waters raged over the banks and into the city streets, causing massive devastation. And for the people who lived through it was a time they'll never forget.
I couldn't believe it, to tell you the truth.
Larry Cordum was 19 during the spring of 1965.
It's one of those things where it isn't real till it happens. And all of the predictions about floods and everything else, I thought, well, it would kind of flood. I never really realized that you could have that much water, that you could fill all of this up.
He was attending the vocational school that used to be behind what is now West High School.
I never believed that there was enough water to fill that up. It would have covered all the cars down there, every one of them.
The waters reached as high as the first floor of the school, which was then simply Mankato High School.
Which seems strange because it sits somewhat on a hill. It's hard to imagine that the flooding could have gone up that high.
I thought maybe a couple of feet in the water, not 10 or 12 feet, something like that. And you don't really know how much 10 or 12 feet is because you really aren't aware of the lay of the land.
Larry rented a house near the school on Front Street that still stands today. But when the house was declared unlivable, he went to North Mankato.
And we were going to come across the bridge, and they wouldn't let us go back across the bridge because there was so much debris coming down the stream.
Larry says he was one of the lucky ones and didn't lose many possessions himself. So he decided to help with the sandbagging efforts.
They were heavy, and it was drizzling, and it was miserable outside. And as long as you kept working, you could keep warm. But we didn't have any rain clothing or anything like that, so We kept warm as long as we were going.
A lot has changed in those 50 years, most notably the massive flood walls that stand close to the river, in order to help ensure that a flood like the one that happened in 1965 never happens again.
You know, a lot of the colleges were closed, the schools were closed because students couldn't go to school. Let's talk a little bit about West High School, which at the time was Mankato High School.
Right, the high school.
And that was at least the second time there had been flooding there, because there's been flooding in the 50s and then now this. So this is kind of a unique situation, I would think.
Right. So West High School, which was Mankato High School, the high school, was brand new in the 1950s, early 1950s, and it was built on the Indian Creek Slough. So when they built it on pylons rather than a traditional foundation that we would expect the building to be built on. But because they knew that they were on a slough area, it was actually built in preparation for any kind of flooding that would come. So when 65 and the water came up to the first floor of the building, the basement was completely flooded. When all the water receded, they didn't find a lot of structural damage, if any at all, because of those pylons, because that's the way that they built the structure. So it was an interesting way to build the building, but it also saved them in the end without having any major damage in 65.
It took scores of volunteers to build sandbag walls to keep the river at bay in 1965. KEYC News 12's Ashley Hanley brings us their story.
As the waters continued to rise, many people wondered what they could do to help. And so people came from all over the region to help with the sandbagging efforts, including right here at this very dike that separates the Minnesota River from Sibley Park.
Everything was rushing, trees were going by, and just everything. It was really, really frightening.
Hank Weber was a North Mankato firefighter in 1965.
Scary. Scary, scary.
As the waters of the Minnesota River threatened his hometown.
Sleep-wise, we didn't.
But what he remembers most is the hundreds of volunteers.
They didn't ask. They said, "What do you want us to do?"
And they came from all over the Midwest to help stop the raging waters.
The young people of the age on the spot in helping, just digging right in, filling sandbags, putting sandbags down, and just being there.
Jim Sprint was also there.
Especially when I get out here, I can remember exactly the way things were. Yeah, and all this entire area, of course, was just a giant rolling water.
Standing here today on the exact same spot he was a half a century ago.
We thought, whoa, this is not good, because it was almost overtopping all the time.
Right near where the old Sibley Zoo used to be.
The water was coming up more rapidly than we were able to sandbag. And then the condition of the dike, when you would drop a sandbag, ripples would go away from the sandbag like it was dropped onto a bowl of Jell-O.
But he kept going for hours and hours.
It was right up to the top, and within this much of the top of the sandbags.
Because no matter how big the force of the water, it wasn't enough to stop the force of those dedicated volunteers.
So we've had people coming together to really fight off the Minnesota River. And there was a very short amount of time, as we had talked about earlier, that they knew they needed to raise those sandbag walls and things like that. And that took a huge community effort to kind of come together and do that.
It did. So within 3 days, they needed to do some major work. The flood wall, the earthen dike that was happening, the sandbags on the North Mankato side, was 3,000 feet long, and they needed to build that up a few feet. So they called in everybody that could help. In a matter of hours and days, literally, they were able to raise that flood wall up. And it took hundreds of thousands of people, not just people filling sandbags, but there were people that were evacuated from their homes. So there were people that opened their homes to people that were displaced, people that cooked meals, that provided any kind of relief that people needed during the flood crisis itself. There were people who were working on those flood walls that were just working themselves till they couldn't move. health. And so there was just a lot of community effort. And after the flood and everything has settled down, that was what you read a lot, what I read a lot in the newspaper was just that, wow, without these people helping, we couldn't have done this. And the volunteers were so incredible. And it said a lot about the community coming together to save the community. But you had high school students who couldn't go to high school because the high school was flooded. The college, although the colleges were closed, you had college students that were ready to start working. At MSU, they used their amateur radio and KMSU radio to be that communication back and forth between people throughout the community so that there could be those lines of communication still open. So there was just a lot of community efforts that came together on so many different levels to just get it done.
Still to come on Remembering the Flood of 1965, a look at the change the flood brought to one of Mankato's popular landmarks and the structural changes that's changed the Mankato landscape forever. Stay with us.